My husband handed me divorce papers at 72, after 44 years of marriage, while I was still wearing the garden gloves I'd had on when I came in from the backyard. By the time the courts were done with me, I had lost the house on Briarfield Drive, the contracting business we'd built together, and every savings account I thought carried both our names. He walked out of the final hearing with his attorney, his girlfriend, and a smirk I had never once seen during 44 years of sitting across the breakfast table from him. He told our son and daughter that I had been the difficult one, that I had made everything harder than it needed to be. 7 weeks after the judge's signature dried on those papers, his business partner called me from the parking lot of a hospital in Raleigh. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Ardith Caulfield. I was 71 when the ground started shifting beneath what I had believed, for decades, was solid. My husband Silas was 73. We had married in the spring of 1981, when he had a borrowed truck, a contractor's license 2 weeks old, and more confidence than sense. And I had been 28 years old, and so certain of the future, I hadn't thought to examine it carefully. I spent 32 years as a school librarian in the Wake County system. Silas built Caulfield Construction into a company that did commercial work across the Raleigh-Durham area. 22 employees at its peak, a name people in the industry recognized. We had 2 children. Our son Corbin lived in Dallas with his wife and their 2 daughters. Our daughter Ansley lived in Cary, 20 minutes from our house on Briarfield Drive, close enough that she had a key. The house on Briarfield Drive was where I had grown my best garden. 4 raised beds, tomatoes and peppers, and 1 stubborn rosemary plant that had survived 11 winters and 2 hurricanes. Silas had helped me build those beds the summer we both retired, cursing at the level and getting the measurements wrong twice, and we had laughed about it at dinner for 3 years after. That was the life I knew. That was the life I believed was permanent. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Silas had carried the same model of Android for 4 years. He was not a technology person. He called the cloud, whatever that means, every time one of our grandchildren mentioned it. In February, I noticed a new phone on the nightstand. Slim, new, no case on it yet. When I asked, he said it was a work phone. The old one was getting slow. That made sense. I let it go. But he started leaving it face down on surfaces. He started sleeping with it on his side of the bed instead of on the charger across the room. He started going to job sites on Sundays, which he had not done since the early years of the company, when there was still something fragile to protect. He came home on those Sundays smelling of something I couldn't place. Not perfume exactly. More like a decision had been made that I was not part of. I watched. I did not confront immediately. I am not a woman who moves without information. 44 years of managing a household and 32 years of managing a school library teaches you that the first version of anything is rarely the whole picture. By April, I had a name. Her name was Laura. She was 48 years old, an interior designer who had worked with Silas's company on 2 commercial renovation projects and who had, apparently, been working with Silas on something else entirely for at least 8 months. I found out the way you find out things when you have been paying careful attention. A receipt in the side pocket of his truck, a restaurant in Durham I had never been to with him, dated a Tuesday. He had told me he was at a job site in Garner. That one receipt was enough to pull the thread. I did not say anything for 2 weeks. In May, I asked him directly. On a Sunday morning, at the kitchen table where we had eaten thousands of breakfasts, I kept my voice level. I asked him who Laura was. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at me across a table I had chosen at an estate sale in 1994, the one with the scratch on the left corner from when Corbin was 12, and tried to build a model plane on it. And he said, with a flatness that I recognized as practiced, "I want out, Ardith. My attorney will reach out to yours by the end of the week." That was all. 44 years. He said it the way he would have told me the furnace needed replacing. What followed was 5 months of legal proceedings I was wholly unprepared for. Silas had retained an attorney named Rupert Gaines, a man who specialized, I later learned, in exactly the kind of asset restructuring that was about to become relevant. By the time I hired my own attorney, a semi-retired estate lawyer named Mr. Tarver, who had done good work on my mother's estate 15 years prior but had not touched a contested divorce. In a decade, Silas's team had already filed their disclosures. The settlement offer came with a stack of financial documents I could not fully read at first. Silas's primary asset was Caulfield Construction. We had built it together. I had never drawn a salary from it, but I had kept his books for 11 years before he hired an accountant. I had hosted clients at our home. I had answered phones during the first 3 summers when there was no one else to answer them. That company was as much mine as it was his, even if my name was never on the letterhead. What I did not know until Mr. Tarver told me, and even then did not understand the full significance of, was that Caulfield Construction no longer existed on paper the way it once had. 14 months before Silas filed for divorce, he had transferred the company's assets, its contracts, equipment, and accounts receivable into a limited liability company called Caulfield Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware. On paper, the contracting business I had helped sustain through its early years was now a corporate entity owned entirely by Silas personally, structured in a way that made it far more difficult to classify as marital property. The company had been valued in Silas's disclosures at a figure that even I, with no legal training, knew felt wrong. Beyond the company, our joint savings had been drawn down significantly. Withdrawals I hadn't noticed, because Silas had always managed the business accounts, had been consistent and substantial over 2 years. What remained was $264,000. The house on Briarfield Drive, fully paid off, was valued at $6.6 million. Mr. Tarver did his best. It was not enough. The settlement gave Silas the house and the business through the LLC. I received $310,000, the joint accounts minus fees and my car. In the courthouse hallway after the final hearing, Silas walked past me, close enough that I could have touched his sleeve. He did not look at me. Then he stopped and turned back and said, quiet enough that only I could hear, "The kids know where their loyalty is. You'll grow old alone." He said it without heat. That was the part that stayed with me. I did not answer. I walked to my car and drove to Mina's house in Greensboro, a drive that took just under 2 hours, and I cried for most of the first hour and was completely hollow for the rest. Mina had been my neighbor on Briarfield Drive for 19 years before she moved to Greensboro to be near her daughter. She was 70 and had been widowed 4 years earlier, and she ran her small house the way she ran everything, with a kind of cheerful competence that I had always admired and now desperately needed. She opened the door before I knocked. She always knew when I was coming, the way old friends do. I stayed 3 weeks. I slept badly. I ate soup and crackers and let myself be briefly, quietly devastated, which I think I needed permission to do, and Mina gave me without my having to ask. She did not tell me things would be fine. She sat with me. She made coffee. She let the silence be what it was. My children called once each during that time. Corbin called on the 3rd day. He said, "Mom," Dad explained what happened. "I think you should let it go." He hung up before I finished my first sentence back to him. Ansley sent a text message. It said she was praying for both of us and needed space to process. Those were my children. I had put Corbin through 4 years of college and driven him to every cross-country meet through middle and high school. I had stayed on the phone with Ansley for 2 hours the night her first marriage ended. I wrote their names down on the first page of a yellow legal pad I found in Mina's kitchen drawer, and I sat with that for a long time. Then I started writing what I actually knew. I am not a lawyer. I spent my career in libraries, which means I know how to find things, and I know the difference between what something says and what it means. The more I studied the timeline, the LLC formed 14 months before Silas filed, the account withdrawals, the valuation that didn't add up, the more something refused to settle right. I called Mr. Tarver from Mina's kitchen. I asked him one question. Had he independently verified that the LLC formation had occurred before Silas made the decision to seek divorce, or was it possible the transfer had been made after that decision, in anticipation of the filing? There was a pause on the line. He said, "That's a very specific question, Ardith." I said, "Can you answer it?" He could not. He had reviewed the documents as filed. He had not gone behind them. That was when I understood what I needed to do. I spent 4 evenings researching on the laptop I'd bought 2 years ago to video call the grandchildren. I found a firm in Raleigh called Reyes & Associates that handled high-asset divorce cases with a focus on financial misconduct. I found that North Carolina law permitted post-judgment motions when fraud could be demonstrated in the original proceedings. I found that asset transfers made within a certain window before a divorce filing could be scrutinized if intent could be established. I wrote all of it down in my careful, even handwriting. Then I called Reyes & Associates and made an appointment for the following Thursday. The attorney who met with me was Davina Reyes herself. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the particular stillness of someone who spends her professional life in rooms where a great deal depends on listening carefully. She did not speak to me with the slight oversimplification some younger people use with women my age. She simply asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. I talked for nearly 2 hours. When I finished, she set her pen down and said, "The LLC formation date is what matters most. Do you know it exactly?" I did not. "That's the first thing we need," she said. "If that company was transferred after he made the decision to end the marriage, and there are ways to establish when that decision was made, you have grounds for a fraud claim that could reopen the settlement entirely." I retained Davina Reyes that afternoon. It cost me $9,500 upfront, more than a third of what I had readily accessible. I paid without hesitation. Some expenditures are not expenses. They are decisions. Davina filed the post-judgment motion within the week, citing potential fraudulent conveyance and requesting full discovery of Silas's financial records from the preceding 3 years. The motion was accepted. Formal discovery notices went to Rupert Gaines and his firm. I know the moment Silas found out because Corbin called. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was back at Mina's house eating leftover soup when his name appeared on my phone screen. Only the second time he had called since the hearing. His voice was controlled in the way that it gets when he is performing calm over something sharper underneath. "Mom, Dad says you've hired new lawyers. He says you're trying to undo the settlement." "I've filed a post-judgment motion," I said. "That's accurate. This is just going to drag everything out and cost you what you have left." I asked whether his father had told him to make this call. He didn't answer that directly. The silence was its own answer. "Tell your father I said hello," I said, and ended the call. I sat quietly in Mina's living room for a long time afterward. Mina came in and sat across from me and didn't say anything, and that was exactly right. The documents came 6 weeks later in a thick envelope from Davina's office. I drove to Raleigh and read them at her conference table. Caulfield Holdings LLC had been incorporated in Delaware on March 2nd of the prior year. Silas's had filed for divorce the following October 18th, 7.5 months between the transfer and the filing. But the document that changed everything was not the formation date. It was a series of emails recovered during discovery, communications between Silas and Rupert Gaines beginning the previous January, 2 months before the LLC was even formed. In those emails, Silas had written, "I need the business outside the marital estate before I file. Laura says we can move faster once that's clean." January, 8 months before he served me papers, while we were still living in the same house, while we were still eating dinner at the same table, while I was still picking up his prescription refills on Tuesday afternoons because he always forgot to go himself. I read that email twice. Then I set the paper down and looked out the window at the parking garage across the street and thought about the scratch on the left corner of the kitchen table, the one from when Corbin was 12. I thought about a great many things. Is this enough? I asked Davina. She allowed herself a small, controlled smile. It's more than enough to proceed, she said. I walked out to the parking lot and stood in the afternoon air for a moment with my hand on the roof of my car. Had I already known this was how it would go? In some way, yes. I had known since that morning in Mina's kitchen when I'd asked Mr. Tarver one question and he could not answer it. I had simply needed the paperwork to confirm what I already understood. Davina filed the formal motion to vacate the settlement that week, attaching the emails as Exhibit A. She also filed for a temporary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of Caulfield Holdings LLC assets while the motion was pending. The injunction was granted within 72 hours. Silas could not move the company, sell the house, or shift assets out of the entity while the case was active. 3 days later, Ansley called. She didn't announce she was coming. She arrived at Mina's door on a Saturday morning, a 3-hour drive from Cary, which told me the visit had been planned with some urgency. She brought flowers. Sunflowers, which had been my favorites for 40 years and which I noticed she had selected carefully. She sat across from me at Mina's kitchen table and folded her hands in a way I recognized as something rehearsed. "Mom," she said, "Dad's very stressed. His attorney says this could go on another year. At his age, the stress alone." "Ansley," I said, "did your father ask you to come?" A pause, one beat too long. "I came because I love you both." "Your father transferred the family business into a shell company while we were still married," I said, keeping my voice level. "He did it after he had already decided to leave me, and before he filed. There are emails dated 14 months before the divorce that prove he planned this with his attorney. I'm not pursuing this because I'm angry. I'm pursuing it because what was done to me was fraud." Something shifted in Ansley's expression. A brief recalibration. She had not, I suspected, known about the emails. "Dad says those communications are being taken out of context." "Then his attorney can explain the context in court," I said. She stayed 2 more hours, returning to the same 3 points each time around. Silas's age, the cost of the litigation, the grandchildren asking questions they didn't have answers to. That last one landed, as she knew it would. I felt it somewhere in my chest, the way you feel cold through a window pane. The grandchildren were real, missing them was real. I did not pretend otherwise. "I love you," I said, before she left. "I want you in my life, but I am not going to drop a legally valid fraud claim because it makes the holidays easier. That is not a choice I am willing to make." She hugged me in the doorway, a careful, obligatory embrace. I watched her car disappear down Mina's street and then went inside and sat in the armchair and let myself feel, fully, the thing I had been holding at a careful distance. It was grief, not for Silas, for the versions of my children I had believed in. I sat with it for a long time. And then, the way it does when you have held something long enough to know its true shape, the grief began to change into something steadier. A clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its precision. I had not created this situation. I had not deceived anyone, transferred any assets, or sent my children as messengers. I had been acted upon, and I had chosen to respond. I picked up the phone and called Mina, who was in the next room, which she found funny. I told her I was fine. She said she knew. We sat together in the living room and she put on the evening news, and I did not watch it, but I was glad it was on. The offer came through Davina's office in early February. Rupert Gaines proposed a revised settlement, $650,000 to me, in exchange for dropping all post-judgment litigation and signing a comprehensive release of claims. The release covered not only the current motion, but any future claims against Silas personally, against Caulfield Holdings LLC, and against Lara in her professional capacity. It included a non-disparagement clause that would have prevented me from discussing the circumstances of my divorce with any third party. It required my signature within 14 days. I read the release language carefully. Every provision was designed not to give me a fair outcome, but to seal an unfair one permanently. The non-disparagement clause was not protection. It was concealment. It was a legal wall around what Silas had done so that no one, not now, not ever, could look at the record and see what had actually happened. I thought about $650,000. I thought about it genuinely. I was 72 years old with no income and mounting legal costs, and I was not so certain of anything that I could dismiss the practical weight of that number. But underneath the calculation was something I had not expected to feel so clearly. It mattered to me that the truth existed somewhere outside my own memory, not just in Mina's living room or Davina's files, on a court record. Acknowledged. Real. "I'm declining," I told Davina. She nodded. She did not look surprised. "I'll send the formal rejection by end of day." The hearing was held on a Tuesday in April in the same courthouse where the original settlement had been finalized. I wore the gray blazer I had bought for my retirement celebration 8 years ago. Some decisions have nothing to do with weather. Silas arrived with Rupert Gaines and a younger associate. He looked thinner and moved more carefully than I remembered. He did not look at me when he entered the courtroom. Davina presented the case methodically. The timeline, the emails, the financial records documenting the systematic transfer of company assets into the LLC, the valuation inconsistencies, the parallel communications with Lara. Each exhibit went in cleanly, explained clearly, connected to the one before it. Rupert Gaines argued that the LLC had been formed for legitimate estate planning purposes, that the January emails were part of a broader conversation about business succession, and that Silas's intent had never been to remove anything from the marital estate. The judge, the Honorable Phyllis Dunmore, had been reading as the testimony proceeded, asking questions in the precise manner of someone who has already located the inconsistency and is simply drawing the other party toward it in an orderly fashion. She asked Rupert Gaines why, if the LLC had been formed for estate planning purposes, his client's communications about it had consistently referenced the divorce filing as the relevant deadline for completing the transfer. Gaines answered. The judge asked a follow-up. Gaines answered again, less steadily this time. Her questions narrowed. Gaines was looking for a door that had closed behind him. Then Silas leaned over and interrupted his own attorney mid-sentence. It was not loud, but the courtroom had gone very quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something has shifted that can't be shifted back. "I built that company," Silas said. 30 years, every contract. Tell her it was mine." Judge Dunmore looked at Silas directly. "Mr. Caulfield, your attorney is addressing the court." Silas straightened. Gaines put a hand briefly on his arm. Silas shook it off with a small, sharp movement. The younger associate leaned in and said something low. Silas shook his head. I watched all of this from 30 feet away and did not look away. I noted it with the same attention I had been paying to everything for the past 18 months. The calculation of a man who had believed, perhaps until very recently, that the outcome was still in his control. When Davina gave her closing, she was clean and exacting and left nothing unaddressed. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and thought about 32 years of school librarian's patience and how it had turned out to be, of all the things I'd accumulated in my life, exactly the thing I most needed for this. Judge Dunmore issued her written ruling 18 days later. I was at Mina's house when Davina called. It was a Thursday morning, early enough that Mina was still in her robe with her second cup of coffee. I picked up at the kitchen table. Judge Dunmore had found, by clear and convincing evidence, that Silas Caulfield had engaged in fraudulent conveyance of marital assets prior to the divorce filing. The formation of Caulfield Holdings LLC had been undertaken in bad faith with the explicit intent of removing the company from the marital estate before litigation commenced. The January emails were cited extensively throughout the opinion. The original settlement was vacated. Caulfield Holdings LLC and all assets within it were returned to the marital estate for proper equitable distribution. Based on North Carolina's equitable distribution standards, the court ordered a revised division. 60% to me, which, accounting for all assets, came to approximately $1.87 million, including either the house on Briarfield Drive or its cash equivalent. Rupert Gaines's conduct was referred to the North Carolina State Bar for review. Laura's involvement in advising Silas on the restructuring. She was a design professional who had helped plan which company assets to move and when, was noted in the ruling. A separate civil claim was possible, Davina told me, if I chose to pursue it. Mina was standing in the kitchen doorway when I set the phone down. She had heard enough. She crossed the kitchen and we held each other the way old friends do, not elegantly, just completely. I felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, the specific relief of a weight that has been carried so long you had stopped noticing it as a weight at all. We didn't speak for a while. There was nothing that needed saying that the quiet couldn't hold better. Then Mina made us both a fresh cup of coffee, and we sat back down and watched the morning light move across her kitchen floor. 7 weeks later, Silas's business partner Brent called me from the parking lot of a hospital in Raleigh. I was, by then, renting a small apartment in Chapel Hill while I worked through the implementation steps with Davina. Brent had been Silas's site supervisor for 11 years. He was, as far as I could tell, a decent man who had not known the full extent of what had been done with the company he had helped build. He called because, in some paperwork somewhere, I was still listed as an emergency contact, and he hadn't known who else to reach. Silas had collapsed on a job site that morning, a severe stroke. He was in intensive care. Laura, Brent said quietly, had left for a trip 2 weeks prior and had not been reachable. I thanked Brent for calling. I asked him to keep me informed of significant changes in condition. I set the phone down and sat in my apartment and was very still for a long time. What do you feel when the man who deceived you is suddenly diminished in this way? I have thought about that question many times since. The answer is not simple, and I am not going to make it simple. I felt something that was partly grief, real, complicated grief for the man he had been before he became the man he was at the end. I felt the particular hollowness of anger that has lost its object. I felt underneath both of those a sober recognition that the court's judgment stood. His stroke did not change what had been decided. It complicated the implementation, but did not undo it. I did not go to the hospital. I did not send flowers. 44 years gave me many things. It did not give me an obligation to perform a tenderness I did not feel. Laura did not return to the Triangle area. I heard later, through no deliberate seeking on my part, that she had relocated to Scottsdale. The professional reputation she had built in Raleigh had not survived the ruling, which had named her involvement in the restructuring in terms that generated attention in industry circles. She had apparently expected a different outcome from the one she received. The implementation of the court's order took 8 months. At the end of it, my portion of the marital estate, after legal fees and all associated costs, came to just under $1.7 million. I was 73 years old. I had again a future. I did not go back to Raleigh. I had made that decision quietly, somewhere in the long months of waiting, without drama or announcement. The house on Briarfield Drive sold in June, $1.65 million, just as above ask. The raised beds were still there. I did not go to see them sold. Some things you release not because they stop mattering, but because holding them no longer serves you. I moved to Brevard, North Carolina, a small town in the mountains west of Asheville that I had visited once years ago on a day trip and remembered for its particular quality of light. The way it came through the tall stands of white pine in the early morning, softer and more patient than Raleigh light. I rented a small house on a narrow street with a porch that faced east and caught the morning sun. I unpacked my books first, then my garden tools. I built one raised bed that first month, just one, and planted the things that grow reliably. Tomatoes, basil, a rosemary cutting I had taken from Mina's garden before I left. I found the Brevard Library and became a regular. I found a reading group that met on Thursday evenings and argued about books with the cheerful seriousness of people who take literature seriously. I made a friend named Rowena, 69, a retired nurse from Knoxville, with a dry wit and a walking pace that covered ground quickly and with purpose. We walked the French Broad River Trail on weekday mornings and went to the farmers market on Saturdays and held our opinions on novels without apology. Mina drove up from Greensboro in August and stayed a long weekend. We sat on the east-facing porch and watched the morning light come through the pines and talked about everything and nothing for 3 days straight. She came again at Christmas. Some things you hold on to. My children and I found our way back to each other, slowly, without pretense. Corbin called more regularly beginning that fall, and the calls grew easier as the months went on. Ansley drove to Brevard in October. She sat on my porch, and without saying the specific words she perhaps couldn't locate, communicated what needed communicating. I accepted it. What I had learned, and what I tried to tell her, only once without lecturing, was that the people closest to us are most vulnerable to the versions of a story that someone powerful has had time to construct. Silas had been the authority in our family for 4 decades. It had taken my children time to see past that. I did not require them to be other than human. The grandchildren appeared in stages, a video call, a visit, then the easy warmth of the ordinary. I did not press. I let it come at whatever pace it came. There is a Meyer lemon tree in the side yard that I planted that first spring. It flowered in February the second winter, and the fragrance on a warm afternoon fills the whole yard. Something I had not anticipated and did not know I needed until I had it. I sat on my east-facing porch one evening in November, 3 years after a Wednesday in October, when a man handed me papers while I was still wearing garden gloves, and I felt something that I can only describe as entirely my own, the difficulty that had produced it, and the peace that followed. Both mine, neither borrowed from anyone, neither contingent on anyone else's choices or anyone else's version of what I deserved. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 71. The people who count on your grief to make you manageable have never properly accounted for what grief becomes when you refuse to let it stay grief. The people who assumed the years had reduced you are almost always undone by discovering that the years had, in fact, done something quite different. They had given me patience. They had given me the steadiness to refuse what was unfair. They had given me the clarity that comes from having survived enough to know exactly what is worth surviving for. I am not a remarkable woman. I am a woman who decided, when it mattered most, to pay attention to what was actually real. What would you have done? Good day, dear listeners. It's Hannah here, and I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. If this story stayed with you, please leave a comment below and tell me what city you're listening from. I would love to know how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I would love for you to be here for them.